But in my short, I mentioned a crossbows. I just want to go a little further in depth if you've seen that short. So basically, there's a couple misconceptions with gunpowder and crossbows and firearms, medieval and feudalistic ages. Pretty simply, they were very effective weapons in regards. It's just you know, it's the classic quality versus quantity type deal. You can have a quality soldier who's an all rounder, or you can have quantity of farm boys who are barely trained. The knowledge it takes, the upper body strength, here's the thing that most people don't realize with archers is those guys were the big, beefy, huge guys. Okay, because it took a lot of strength to pull a two-handed bow. Horseback bows are a little bit less upper body strength, but you still had to be strong. You still had to be skilled. You still had to have very good technique. You're on a horse, you're bouncing up and down. You have to have proper form and posture. The samurai, their main weapon was the bow. Then their secondary was the spear. Then outside of that, if they got knocked off their horse or something, their last primary form of defense was a sword. They were not swordsmen only. They were archers first, spearmen second, and then swordsmen last. When they had a duel or something to the death or whatnot, yeah, of course, is sword honor, blah blah blah. You know, they're doing an ambush and they're attacking somebody at camp late at night. They got their ninjutsu gown on, and they're being a ninja. They're gonna use even shorter swords and shurikens and all that. Which I also want to point out, ninja and samurai. Most samurai were ninja. Some ninja were not samurai, but most samurai were ninja. Now, Nobunaga started using firearms and everything, and he bought them from the Dutch. The Dutch happened to be around Japan, and he really heavily used firearms because he could take any poor farm boy and teach him in about a week how to properly use a firearm. Now, firearms at this point in time were slow. They weighed more than a spear or a sword or a bow and arrow combined, and you really could not fire these on horseback. It was really you if you had enough skill, maybe you could, but it was really not recommended. You were also definitely not getting to reload it afterwards. That being said, you could train anybody to use a firearm. That's not the case today. There's a lot of people who are too stupid to ever have a firearm. They tend to blow holes in themselves. But you have that, and then you also had the fact, crossbows were kind of the same, where they were very effective. They could easily kill a man, but you could quickly train somebody. There were a variety of crossbows, all of them very powerful. Some of them, there were cases of them punching through steel plate, and there were cases of steel plate stopping a crossbow bolt. Crossbows don't have the same range as arrows. They still have considerable range. Don't get that wrong. But and then the other problem was if you had like a 500-pound medieval drawweight crossbow, which was incredibly rare. Yes, it could punch through armor, but there were accounts of, and there's been real life testing that they break in after being fired once or even twice. You know, maybe even fired a third time, but you're really pushing your luck and having a malfunction that could actually harm and injure you. There were other crossbows that were less powerful that could be used much more effectively. The thing about crossbows and firearms is they were very again reiterating they're very easy to train. A bowman was somebody who took years and years of experience. He mastered his trade. Being an archer by itself was an entire trade. Being a man who rows a boat at that time by itself was an entire trade. Being a Fletcher, a guy who just adds the feather to arrows, basically. Not even the arrowhead part, not even making the rest of the arrows. That just by itself was a trade. It was a craft of quality, and they tried to mitigate human error with skill. So, you know, there is, of course, crossbows nowadays are fantastic firearms that are super amazing. Things that are much more complicated, require more training. Don't compare the modern day weapon to the previous weapon. You're going to get the wrong idea every time. The other thing is, I also want to point out crossbows and firearms of that period of the medieval ages, even a little bit after medieval ages, the feudalistic era, all those were slow and clumsy. The firearms of the Civil War were slow and clumsy. Because that one was actually more at fault of everybody involved in the Civil Wars. They were cheap. You know, the American Revolution, slow and clumsy again. They got better progressively, and it got to the point where they got good enough that you could never go back to full knights in armor. The other thing is actually modern day armor overall is better. Our quality of steel compared to the pig iron that some of the knights were wearing in the 1500s. Yeah, no, it doesn't even hold a candle. Okay, the you can see right when firearms got better because if you look at how many people died in ship to ship combat, uh, involving a case where the parties boarding each ship attacked each other, you'll notice right after the Civil War, right when firearms really started getting incredibly effective, where things like having a magazine was the norm and, sights and all these other different things and certain mechanisms, you'll notice there's a sudden, just 200% increase in the number of deaths on ship to ship battles. Uh, you know, the other thing to point out is we think of firearms now as light. AR-15 doesn't weigh more than, you know, 4 pounds, 8 ounces. That's incredibly light for something with such, volume of fire. 30 round magazine, all that. The PP Bison, comes to people's minds. They're like, oh, well, what about that? That holds a lot more volume of fire. The ammunition has weight, buddy. Those ones are actually heavier than an AR-15, which is kind of funny to think about. But these guns are incredibly light, and people push them to be lighter and lighter and lighter. Polymer frames and carbon fiber and nitrate coatings over weakened steel. Some of them even are aluminum bodies, submachine guns. All of these are incredible. They're incredibly light, but because they're so incredibly light, people just kind of weirdly assume that the firearms of the medieval ages, even the ones that were carried by a singular person, were light. They weren't. They were actually heavier than a sword. They were. It was heavier to carry your firearm, your gunpowder, your shot, your packing rod, your cleaning rod. All that equipment was actually heavier to carry than to carry, uh, you know, a plate of armor and or chainmail or leather guards or things that are very effective at protecting you. And a lot of people did wear leather jerkins. Okay, and then also have a spear and a sword and a bow and arrow and whatever thing else that you needed, and a tool set in case you need to burglarize a home or something. All those things were lighter. Not everybody's wearing steel plate, but here's the thing: is even though steel plate is, realistically on average, knight's armor was about 80 to 120 pounds of gear. If you look at what the modern day soldiers wearing, it's about 80 pounds to 120 pounds of gear, depending on what they're doing. Light reconnaissance might only have 40 pounds of gear. Depends. The other thing is, it was designed in such a way that you wear it close to your body and everything, you don't actually feel the full weight of what you're wearing. Whereas when you carry something meaningfully, like a rifle, you can't dissipate the weight across the body. So you constantly feel that weight. So you get a firearm that's, you know, a chunk of cast iron and, with his best craftsmanship as the technology allowed at the time, but it weighs, you know, 30 or 40 pounds. I'd rather be the knight in armor, you know, because the knight in armor, even though he's in, 3 to 4 times heavier gear, he's actually not feeling all that weight. Your trooper running around with his little flintlock, he's feeling that weight quite a bit because he has to make an active effort to carry. He can't just, you know, have it on his body and forget about it. The other thing to also point out is, soldiers, troops, um, pikemen, all these guys, they all had horses, uh, but, the knights that are riding their horse in the battle, they have a whole animal to carry them in battle. Uh, you know, a firearms guy, he's not riding a horse in battle. It's already taking him 5, 6, 10, half an hour just to reload. You can't mix a horse into that. So this guy is having to fight the whole battle. He might be stationary, except here's the other thing with firearms: is bow and arrows had better range than crossbows or firearms. So by the time this guy is, you know, getting ready to fire and everything, or he's already got everything packed and ready to fire, he's waiting for this enemy to be in his range. Bow and arrows have been raining down all match. Heavy cannons on artillery were used and were used to great distances, but that was a big thing. That was like, taking 4-man teams, they had to know what they're doing. Uh, the same thing with the longer bolts and things, catapults, like the Romans use siege weapons basically. Those were entire teams doing that stuff, and they knew what they were doing. They were very good at it. Those were much more effective. Single person firearms and crossbows is what I'm talking about. Those, everything else has already been fired. Now you're the last ditch effort of an enemy, or you're on a hill set up in an ambush or something. You're not the guy who's trying to go for maximum range or who's trying to eliminate the entire forces. You're the guy that the enemy has realized they're being ambushed, or the enemy is charging you because they've made it past the pikemen or defenses, and now you're firing. Uh, there might be some infantrymen with you. There might not. There were battles where uh, it sucked to be the fire guy because, well, you knew that everybody just died in front of you and you're the last line of defense, and now you have the leftover knights and the leftover infantrymen and the leftovers charging at you while archers are raining down arrows on you, and those archers can hit you but you can't hit them back. And I would not be surprised if most of the people who fled near the end of a battle were the guys using firearms. Because here's the other thing, this goes back into bunch of poor farmers. Bunch of poor farmers in the last line of defense. Not a very effective thing. It was so ineffective that some armies, some very effective armies, decided, screw doing firearms. Let's just continue to use pikemen. Because as long as those pikemen have a little bit of a backbone and no formation, they can hold down anything. Now, you might be wondering, like, who am I talking about? Well, Japan invented gunpowder before the Romans. The Macedonians actually had access to gunpowder at some point. Now, Japan's a weird case and everything because, in Asia is a weird case because certain parts of Asia, like Japan, actually lost the technology, and that's why Nobunaga had to buy firearms from the Dutchmen. But there was a time where they had the technology and nobody else did, or some people that had involvement in the Silk Trade Road, or people who traveled a lot. Some people who, like Alexander the Great, who went all the way to Egypt, did have access, but still chose not to go for it because it wasn't worth it at the time. And that was a really good debate. You know, and here's the other thing: is the other problem too is firearms are great if you're a smaller force taking on a larger force. Nobunaga, smaller force. Macedonia, they revolutionized getting new people into their ranks. They take a city, they don't brutalize a city, they befriend them afterwards. There were people who definitely earned Alex's ire and have been, tied to a horse and dragged around the city until they were dead. But, there were also a lot of people who joined Alex the Great. Uh, the Romans, very good at conscripting people, either, you know, by choice or by force. You know, conscription was very big, and the other thing is armies were very big. Towards the medieval ages, when people started fighting with each other and lords started arguing with each other, and everybody was trying to be king and kill each other and backstab each other, and there were a bunch of little small skirmishes. It was rare to see an incredibly large army like the likes of the Greeks had, or the Persians, or the Romans. That was a bygone thing. Now you had like little battles between 1,000, any maximum like 20,000. Okay, rare instances where somebody managed to unify their kingdom and get larger numbers like the Greeks or the Romans had, and then go and try to take somebody else with large numbers like that. Most of the cases, it was like some little pissant lord with like 920 men and some shithead bandit with like 800 men, started writing letters, Dear Sir John Knight the Third, you are a surly douchebag, blah, 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 blah. Okay, and then I will meet you on the fields of blah, 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 blah. And then they would fight each other. When you start having those kind of small forces, interestingly, pikemen don't work as well in small numbers like that. But firearms start to shine because it's going to inevitably end in a battle that's going to be very close. And inevitably, your troops probably aren't going to be very well trained. And quite a few of your troops are going to be serfs and peasants who don't want to be serfs and peasants anymore. They want to try to uproot their life into something better. And well, unlike the knight, they weren't training with the sword. You know, when the peasant was drinking, the knight was training the sword. When the peasant was getting laid, the knight was training with the sword. When the peasant was reading a book, the knight was probably reading a book. The peasant actually wasn't. You know, the peasant probably couldn't even read because he never bothered to study to read, because that's not helpful when you're trying to grow crops, but it's very helpful when you're trying to learn about books of warfare and battle techniques. When the peasant was hung over and slept in, the knight was training with the sword, or the spear, or, any other weapon. So these guys were not skilled. You're not going to hand them a sword and expect them to do well. You could spend 5 or 6 months training them pikemanship. This doesn't take a very long time, but then you also run two risks. Well, firstly, you might not have 5 or 6 months, but secondly, you also run the risk of them being a coward, because pikemen only work. Not only do they only work in large numbers, they only work if you can convince that peasant to stand there. That's all he has to do to be safe is stand still in the face of danger. That knight starts charging at him, and he knows just how tough and hardened that knight is. He knows that knight has killed hundreds of peasants like him. He pisses his pants and runs, and he dies. And he, it's that simple. But if he stands still, that pikeman charges, and he has to turn away because the spear is there, and the horse is not going to let it impale itself on the pikeman. So the less effective the numbers are, the less secure that peasant also feels. So the more likely he is to run. Here's the other thing: is what's a pikeman's worst enemy? Oh, archers. Archers or anybody with kind of range. So if your opponent invests in firearms guys and archers, and you invest in pikemen, and that's all you have, you're probably going to lose that battle, even if you do get in close. So, as conflicts got smaller and smaller, and lords got shittier and shittier, and people got less and less skilled and dumber, firearms and crossbows became more and more popular, especially as the numbers decreased. Let's see now, how do I end this? I think it's this button. Yeah.